Hi, fourth graders. Are you ready to jump back into chapter 27 of Tiger Rising? I have a hidden treat for you. We are going to read chapter 27 and 28 today. So let's find out, as Rob and Sistine were saying they're going to let the tiger go. Let's find out what happens today. Chapter 27. The first key slid into the lock so smoothly that it made Robbie dizzy with amazement. It was going to be so easy to let the tiger go. Hurry, said Sistine to him. Hurry up, get the other locks. He opened the second lock and the third, and then he took them off one by one and handed them to Sistine, who laid them on the ground. Now open the door, she said. Rob's heart pounded and fluttered in his chest. What if he eats us? He asked. He won't, said Sistine. He'll leave us alone out of gratitude. We're his emancipators. Emancipators means like you free somebody. Rob flung the door wide open. Get out of the way, he shouted, and they both jumped back from the door and waited. But the tiger ignored them. He continued to pace back and forth in the cage, oblivious to the open door. Go on, Rob said to him. You're free, Sistine whispered. But the tiger did not even look in the direction of the door. Sistine crept forward and grabbed hold of the cage. She shook it. Get out, she screamed. Come on, she said, turning to Rob. Help me, get him out. Rob grabbed hold of the fence and shook it. Get, he said. The tiger stopped pacing and turned to stare at them, both clinging like monkeys to the cage. Can you just picture this in your mind? Go on, Rob shouted, suddenly furious. He shook the cage harder. He yelled. He put his head back and howled, and he saw that the sky above them was thick with clouds, and that made him even angrier. He yelled louder. He shouted at the dark sky. He shook the cage as hard as he could. Sistine put a hand on his arm. Shh, she said. He's leaving. Watch. As they stared, the tiger stepped with grace and delicacy out of the cage. He put his nose up and sniffed. He took one tiny step and then another. Then he stopped and stood still. Sistine clapped her hands, and the tiger turned and looked back at them, both, his eyes blazing. And then he started to run. He ran so fast it looked to Rob like he was flying. His muscles moved like a river. It was hard to believe that a cage had ever contained him. It didn't seem possible. The tiger went leaping through the grass, moving farther and farther away from Sistine and Rob. He looked like the sun rising and setting again. And watching him go, Rob felt his own heart rising and falling, beating in time. Chapter 28. Oh, said Sistine in that voice that Rob loved. See, she said that was the right thing to do. Rob nodded, but in his mind he saw a flash of green. He remembered what happened to Cricket. What? Said Sistine, turning to him. What are you thinking about? Rob shook his head. Nothing, he told her. Robert! The sound of his name came floating to them from the tracks of the motel. That's my dad, he said, confused. That's my dad calling me. And they heard Willie Mae. Do goodness, she screamed, her voice high and wild. And then there was a crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent. And when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine trees and saw them, she stopped. Thank you, Jesus, she said, looking up at the sky. 2 whole children. Thank you. Come here, she said. And she opened her arms. Come to me. Rob started walking to her. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that he did not feel whole, but he did not have the energy, the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was keep walking toward Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back, and when Rob saw the tiger on the ground and his father standing over it holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger as big and powerful as the tiger. Bigger. You killed him, he said to his father. I had to, his father said. That was my tiger, Rob screamed. You killed him. You killed my tiger. He ran at his father and attacked him. He beat him with his fists. He kicked him, but his father stood like a wall. He held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Rob saw that hitting wasn't going to be enough. So he did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase. and the words sprang out of it, coiled and explosive. I wish it had been you, he screamed. I wish it had been you that night. I hate you. You ain't the one I need. I need her. I need her. The world and everything in it seemed to stop moving. He stared at his father. His father stared at him. Say her name, Rob screamed into the silence. You say it! Caroline, his father whispered with the gun still over his head, with his eyes still open. And with that word, with the small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion. Like an old merry-go-round, it started to spin again. His father put the gun down and pulled Rob to him. Caroline, his father whispered. Caroline, Caroline, Caroline. Rob buried his face in his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. I need her, Rob said. I need her too, said his father, pulling Rob closer. But we don't got her, neither one of us. All we got is each other. And we got to learn to make do with that. I ain't going to cry, Rob said, shining in his eyes. But the tears leaked out of him anyway. Then they came in a rush and he couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside of himself, from the place where his mother had been. The same place that the tiger had been and was gone now. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his own eyes. All right, said his father, holding Rob tight. That's all right, he said. You're okay. When Rob finally looked up again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was a baby, rocking her and saying, shh. Willie Mae stared back at him. Don't you think you're going to start pounding on me now, she said. No, ma'am, said Rob. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his father's arms. I went and got your daddy, Willie Mae told Rob as he swayed back and forth, rocking Sistine. I figured out what you was going to do, and there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of that cage. I went and got your daddy so he could save you. Yes, ma'am, said Rob. He went over and stood over the open-eyed tiger. The bullet hole in his head was red and small. It didn't look big enough to kill him. Go ahead and touch him, said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled. Her eyes were red. Rob stared at her and she nodded, so he knelt and put a hand and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt the tears rise up in him again. Sistine crouched down next to him. She put her hand on the tiger too. He was so pretty, she said. He was one of the prettiest things I had ever seen. Rob nodded. We have to have a funeral for him, Sistine said. He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him right. Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hand over the rough fur again, and while the tears traveled down his cheeks and dropped onto the ground. How are you feeling right now? Rob finally opened up his suitcase. I wonder what's going to happen next. I'm going to leave you pondering that, and I can't wait to hear what your thoughts are.